The crystalline data pad trembled slightly in my four-finger grasp as I read the assignment for the third time. Observer Zekthal of the Galactic Confederation Intelligence Division, reporting for duty aboard the human vessel Defiance. My mission, to study human combat behavior and report back to the High Council with comprehensive behavioral analysis. I had spent the better part of 2 cycles studying human culture from afar, poring over their transmissions, their art, their crude entertainment broadcasts. The humans fascinated the Council in ways that made many of my colleagues uncomfortable. Here was a species that had barely mastered interplanetary travel, yet they had somehow managed to carve out a small but growing territory in the outer rim of the galaxy. More puzzling still was their apparent disregard for the established order that had governed galactic civilization for millennia. The Defiance was a human-heavy cruiser, scarred and patched from numerous engagements. As my shuttle approached the docking bay, I couldn't help but notice the crude repairs visible across the hull. Welded patches covered what must have been significant damage, and the entire vessel bore the weathered appearance of a ship that had seen far too much combat. My own people, the Veltar, prized efficiency and elegant engineering. Our ships were works of art, smooth and pristine. This human vessel looked more like a mobile scrapyard. Captain Sarah Chan met me at the airlock, her weathered face bearing the kind of lines that spoke of too many sleepless nights and difficult decisions. She was smaller than I had expected, barely reaching my shoulder, but something in her bearing suggested that underestimating her would be a grave mistake. "Observer Zekthal," she said, extending her hand in a human gesture of greeting. I had studied this custom, though the physical contact still felt alien to my touch-sensitive fingertips. "Welcome aboard the Defiance. I trust your journey from the Confederate listening post was comfortable." "Adequate, Captain Chun," I replied, carefully modulating my translator to ensure proper human inflection. "I appreciate your willingness to accommodate a Confederate observer during your current mission." Her smile was sharp. "Well, when the High Council requests something, we humans have learned it's usually wise to comply. Besides, it might be educational for both of us." She led me through the corridors of her ship, and I found myself constantly surprised by what I observed. The crew moved with a casual efficiency that seemed to contradict everything I knew about proper military protocol. Personnel would pause their duties to exchange brief words with their captain, and she responded to each with what appeared to be genuine interest. Among my people, strict hierarchy was maintained at all times. Officers were addressed with proper formality, and casual conversation between ranks was highly discouraged. "Your crew seems remarkably informal," I observed as we passed a group of technicians who had actually laughed at something their captain had said. "Informal?" Chen paused, considering the word. "I suppose we are. But informal doesn't mean undisciplined, observer. When a shooting starts, every person on this ship knows exactly what's expected of them." My quarters were Spartan, but functional, equipped with the environmental controls necessary for my physiology. Captain Chun had gone to considerable trouble to ensure my comfort, which struck me as unnecessarily accommodating. In Confederate military doctrine, observers were provided with basic necessities and nothing more. Comfort was considered a distraction from duty. "We'll be reaching the Kepler system in approximately 18 hours, Chen informed me as she prepared to leave. "Intel suggests the hegemony has established a forward supply base there. Our job is to take it out before they can launch their next offensive against the Centauri colonies." The hegemony. Even among my people, that name carried weight. The Krexhai hegemony had been expanding aggressively for the better part of a century, absorbing or destroying dozens of smaller civilizations. Their technology was advanced, their military machine seemingly unstoppable, and their philosophy brutally simple. The strong consumed the weak. The fact that humans had been fighting them for the past 5 years and hadn't been completely annihilated was puzzling enough. That they were actually launching offensive operations was almost incomprehensible. I spent the journey to Kepler studying the ship's crew and their preparations for battle. What I observed challenged every assumption I had made about human military effectiveness. Their equipment was a patchwork of different technologies, some human-made, others clearly salvaged from defeated enemies. Their tactics appeared to rely heavily on improvisation rather than established doctrine. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to approach the upcoming battle with what could only be described as enthusiasm. Lieutenant Commander Torres, the ship's tactical officer, exemplified this attitude. When I questioned her about the upcoming engagement, her response was both illuminating and deeply unsettling. "The hegemony thinks they understand us," she said, her fingers dancing over tactical displays with practiced ease. "They've fought dozens of species, and they always follow the same pattern. Analyze enemy capabilities, apply overwhelming force at the point of greatest weakness, accept surrender or complete destruction. Clean, efficient, predictable. And humans do not follow this pattern." Her grin was predatory. "Observer, humans wrote the book on asymmetrical warfare long before we ever left our home system. The hegemony's greatest advantage is also their greatest weakness. They're so used to everyone following logical, predictable patterns that they don't know how to handle opponents who refuse to be logical." I found this explanation deeply troubling. Military effectiveness was supposed to be based on superior technology, training, and tactical doctrine. The idea that unpredictability could be a strategic advantage seemed to contradict everything I understood about warfare. As we approached the Kepler system, I was granted permission to observe the bridge during the engagement. The tactical displays showed the hegemony base, a massive orbital platform surrounded by a defensive fleet of 6 heavy cruisers and numerous smaller escort vessels. The human attack force consisted of the Defiance and 2 other ships of similar class. By any logical analysis, the humans were dramatically outgunned. "Captain," reported the sensor operator, "Hegemony fleet is maintaining standard defensive formation. No indication they've detected our approach." "Excellent. Torres, are we ready to execute Plan Charlie?" "All ships report ready, Captain. Though I should mention that Admiral Voss called it absolutely insane when we transmitted the plan to headquarters." Captain Chin's laugh was genuinely amused. "The Admiral always says that. He'll change his tune when we bring him a captured hegemony supply depot." I had studied Plan Charlie during the approach, and I had to agree with Admiral Voss. The humans intended to approach the hegemony fleet at maximum speed, launch a coordinated missile strike at the orbital platform, and then use the resulting explosion and debris field to mask a close-range assault on the defending ships. The plan relied on precise timing, exceptional piloting, and what appeared to be an enormous amount of luck. "Observer," Captain Chun turned to address me directly, "you might want to secure yourself in that acceleration couch. Things are about to get interesting." The attack began exactly as planned, which is to say it immediately devolved into controlled chaos. The human ships accelerated toward their targets at speeds that pushed their crews to the limits of endurance. Their missile salvos timed to arrive at the precise moment when the hegemony defenders would be blinded by the explosion of their own supply depot. But the hegemony weren't helpless victims. Their return fire was devastating, and within minutes the Defiance was taking significant damage. Hull breaches triggered automatic emergency seals, and the deck beneath my feet vibrated with the impact of enemy weapons. Any logical military commander would have ordered a withdrawal. Instead, Captain Chun began issuing orders that seemed designed to get her ship destroyed even faster. "Torres, bring us in closer. I want to be inside their energy weapon minimum range." "Captain, that puts us dangerously close to their point defense systems." "Exactly. They can't use their heavy guns without risking damage to their own ships." "Hernandez, prepare boarding pods." I stared at the tactical display in absolute horror. "Captain Chun, surely you don't intend to board a hegemony vessel?" Her smile was fierce. "Observer, you're about to learn something very important about humans. We don't just fight to win. We fight to make sure our enemies remember why they should have left us alone in the first place." What followed was 30 minutes of the most intense combat I had ever witnessed. The humans didn't just attack the hegemony ships. They seemed to deliberately choose the most dangerous possible approach to every tactical problem. When logic dictated retreat, they advanced. When doctrine called for defensive maneuvers, they launched boarding assaults. When any sane species would have accepted defeat, they turned their damaged ships into improvised weapons. I watched Lieutenant Commander Torres coordinate a boarding action while simultaneously directing the ship's fire control. Her voice steady despite the fact that half the bridge was open to space and everyone was operating in emergency pressure suits. I saw Captain Chun order her ship into a collision course with a hegemony heavy cruiser, only to veer away at the last possible second while launching every remaining weapon at point-blank range. But it was the crew's behavior that truly stunned me. They didn't fight like soldiers following orders. They fought like individuals who had personally decided that the hegemony needed to be stopped, regardless of the cost to themselves. When a main power grid failed, they rerouted systems manually. When the life support was damaged, they shared emergency oxygen without being ordered to do so. When the ship's computer was destroyed by enemy fire, they calculated firing solutions in their heads. Most alien of all was their attitude toward their own casualties. When Ensign Rodriguez was killed by shrapnel from a hull breach, his death seemed to make the surviving crew members more determined rather than demoralized. They didn't grieve, they became angry. And angry humans, I was learning, were terrifying opponents. The battle's turning point came when the Defiance, now barely functional, managed to destroy the hegemony flagship by ramming it with their own ship's detached engineering section. The section had been rigged with every remaining explosive device on the ship, turning it into a massive improvised bomb. The explosion not only destroyed the enemy command vessel, but also crippled 2 other ships and left the remainder of the hegemony fleet in complete disarray. As the surviving enemy vessels retreated, Captain Chin surveyed her devastated bridge and began issuing orders for damage control and casualty assessment. Her ship was a wreck, her crew was exhausted, and they had lost nearly 20% of their personnel. By any logical measure, this should have been considered a Pyrrhic victory at best. Instead, the crew was celebrating. "Observer," Captain Chin said, finally, turning her attention back to me. "I hope this has been educational. We humans have a saying, it's not about the size of the dog in the fight, it's about the size of the fight in the dog." I nodded, though I wasn't certain I truly understood what I had witnessed. The humans had won through tactics that should have resulted in their annihilation. They had turned their apparent weaknesses into advantages, and they had achieved victory through methods that violated every principle of rational military doctrine. As I began composing my initial report to the Confederate High Council, I found myself struggling to explain what I had observed. How could I make them understand that humans didn't just fight differently than other species? They seemed to approach the very concept of conflict from a fundamentally different perspective. The next few days would prove even more enlightening as I watched the crew of the Defiance deal with the aftermath of their victory. But already I was beginning to suspect that my original mission parameters had been far too narrow. Understanding human combat behavior would require understanding something much deeper about their nature as a species. And I was beginning to realize that what I discovered might change everything the Galactic Confederation thought it knew about these strange, unpredictable creatures from the 3rd planet of an unremarkable yellow star. The aftermath of the battle revealed aspects of human behavior that proved even more puzzling than their combat tactics. As I moved through the damaged corridors of the Defiance, observing the crew's response to their victory, I found myself questioning fundamental assumptions about military psychology and species behavior. The human concept of damage control was unlike anything in Confederate doctrine. Among my people, battle damage was assessed, prioritized by strategic importance, and repaired according to strict protocols. The crew of the Defiance approached their repairs with what could only be described as creative chaos. Chief Engineer Martinez exemplified this approach. I found him in what had once been the main engineering section, now partially open to space and functioning on emergency life support. Rather than waiting for proper replacement parts, he was fabricating repairs using salvage components from destroyed hegemony ships. "Observer," he said, looking up from a power coupling that appeared to be held together with metallic tape, and what humans called creative engineering. "You look confused." "Chief Martinez, your repair methodology appears to violate numerous safety protocols. That power coupling cannot possibly meet standard specifications." His grin was infectious, though I didn't understand why. Standard specifications are for people who have standard problems. This coupling will carry 3 times the rated load and probably outlast the rest of the ship. Sometimes you have to make things work with what you've got, not what the manual says you should have. This philosophy seemed to permeate every aspect of human military culture. Dr. Sarah Okafor, the ship's chief medical officer, was treating wounded crew members with a combination of advanced medical technology and improvised solutions that would have horrified Confederate medical authorities. "Doctor," I observed during one of her treatment sessions, "you appear to be using a food synthesizer component as part of that patient's life support system." She didn't look up from her work. "The synthesizer has a perfectly good molecular filtration system, and Lieutenant Park needs kidney dialysis until his own organs heal. Sometimes the best medical equipment is whatever keeps your patient alive." But it wasn't just their practical adaptability that set humans apart. It was their response to loss and trauma that truly challenged my understanding of military psychology. I had expected the crew to be demoralized by their casualties. 23 people had died during the engagement, including several who had been well-respected among their peers. In Confederate military culture, such losses would result in formal grief protocols, efficiency reviews, and careful analysis to prevent future casualties. The humans held something they called a wake. The event took place in the ship's main recreation area, which had been hastily repaired after taking direct damage during the battle. The crew gathered to share stories about their fallen comrades, consume alcoholic beverages, and engage in behavior that seemed to oscillate between celebration and mourning. Captain Chun found me observing from a corner, no doubt looking as confused as I felt. "Not what you expected, observer." "Captain, I confess I do not understand the purpose of this gathering. Your crew has suffered significant casualties, yet they appear to be celebrating." She handed me a drink, some kind of fermented beverage that humans seem to consider essential for social bonding. "We're not celebrating their deaths, Zekthal. We're celebrating their lives. Those 23 people chose to serve on this ship, knowing the risks. They died fighting for something they believed in. The least we can do is remember them as they lived, not just mourn them as they died." I watched as Ensign Kim, barely out of training according to her personnel file, stood on an improvised stage and told a humorous story about Lieutenant Rodriguez, who had been killed during the battle. The crew laughed at appropriate moments, and several individuals wiped tears from their eyes. The combination of emotions was unlike anything in my experience. "Among my people," I told Captain Shun, "we honor the dead through contemplation and formal remembrance ceremonies. This gathering seems almost disrespectful." Her expression grew serious. "Different species grieve differently, observer. But I'll tell you something about humans that your Confederate files probably don't mention. We don't just fight for survival or territory or resources. We fight for each other. Every person who died on this ship died protecting their shipmates, their families back home, and people they'll never meet on worlds they'll never see. That's worth celebrating." The concept was alien to me, yet I found myself oddly moved by the proceedings. When Chief Martinez stood to sing something called a sea shanty in memory of his fallen engineers, his voice cracking with emotion, I began to understand that human military effectiveness might stem from sources that Confederate analysis had never considered. The next morning brought new challenges that further demonstrated human adaptability. Long-range sensors detected an approaching hegemony patrol fleet, clearly responding to the distress signals from the previous day's engagement. Standard Confederate doctrine would call for immediate retreat to friendly space for repairs and reinforcement. Captain Chun called a senior staff meeting that I was permitted to observe. Tactical analysis suggests 6 heavy cruisers and multiple escort vessels, Lieutenant Commander Torres reported. Our current damage levels make engagement inadvisable. Inadvisable, Chief Martinez added, but not impossible. Give me 4 more hours, and I can have the main engines back online. Weapons will be limited, but we'll have mobility. Dr. Okafor looked up from her medical reports. I've got 17 crew members who shouldn't be on duty according to medical standards, but they've all volunteered to remain at their posts if needed. I found myself speaking before I fully considered the implications. Captain Chun, surely you cannot be considering engagement with a superior force when your ship is barely functional. The silence that followed my interruption was telling. Every human in the room turned to look at me, and their expressions ranged from surprise to something that might have been pity. Observer, Captain Chun said carefully, you're thinking like Confederate. Analyze the situation logically, calculate odds of success, choose the option with the highest probability of favorable outcome. That's not how humans work. Then, how do you work? It was Torres who answered. We look at the situation and ask ourselves a different question. Not can we win, but what happens if we don't try? Those hegemony ships aren't just hunting us. They're heading toward human space, probably to reinforce the next offensive against our colonies. If we can delay them, damage them, maybe even destroy a few of them, we save lives. But the risk to your own vessel and crew is acceptable, Chief Martinez interrupted, because the alternative is unacceptable. Observer, humans have been fighting impossible odds since before we left our home world. We've learned that sometimes the only way to win is to refuse to accept that you're supposed to lose. The meeting continued with detailed planning for what could only be described as an ambush. The humans intended to use the debris field from the destroyed supply depot to mask their approach, launch a surprise attack, and then retreat before the superior enemy force could respond effectively. It was audacious, risky, and completely contrary to established military doctrine. But as I watched them plan, I began to recognize patterns that Confederate analysis had missed. Human tactical thinking wasn't random or illogical. It was based on different assumptions about acceptable risk and the nature of victory itself. The ambush took place 8 hours later. I observed from the bridge, now somewhat more secure in my acceleration couch after experiencing human combat maneuvering. The Defiance, still showing obvious battle damage, approached the hegemony patrol from concealment within the debris field. Contact in 30 seconds, reported the sensor operator. Remember, Captain Chun announced to her crew, we're not here to win a fleet engagement. We're here to hurt them badly enough that they think twice about their next offensive. What followed was exactly what the humans had planned, a brief, violent encounter that maximized damage to the enemy while minimizing their own exposure. The Defiance and her escorts launched every available weapon, targeted critical systems on the largest hegemony vessels, and then retreated before the enemy could mount an effective counterattack. The engagement lasted less than 10 minutes. When it was over, one hegemony heavy cruiser had been completely destroyed, 2 others were severely damaged, and the remainder of the patrol was dealing with various degrees of systems failure. The human ships had taken additional damage, but remained combat effective. Mission accomplished, Torres reported with obvious satisfaction. That patrol won't be reinforcing anyone for quite a while. As the human ships set course for friendly space, I found myself reviewing everything I had observed during my time aboard the Defiance. The humans had achieved tactical objectives that should have been impossible given their technological and numerical disadvantages. They had done so through methods that violated every principle of rational military doctrine. Yet they had succeeded. More puzzling still was their attitude toward their own accomplishments. There was no arrogance, no sense of superiority over their enemies. They treated each victory as a temporary advantage that would require constant vigilance to maintain. Observer, Captain Chin approached as I stood studying the tactical displays. You've been very quiet since the engagement. I hope our methods haven't been too disturbing. Captain, I must ask you a direct question. How many of your crew expected to survive this mission when it began? Her smile was sad. Honestly, maybe half. We've been fighting the hegemony for 5 years. Zek Thul. We know the odds. But we also know that someone has to fight them, and we'd rather it be us than civilians who can't fight back. Yet you continue to accept missions with such poor survival prospects. That's just it, Observer. We don't see them as poor survival prospects. We see them as opportunities to make sure our species survives. Every hegemony ship we destroy, every base we eliminate, every offensive we delay, that's human worlds that don't get invaded, human families that don't get enslaved or killed. I was beginning to understand that human military effectiveness couldn't be measured using conventional metrics. Their strength didn't come from superior technology or overwhelming numbers. It came from something much more fundamental: their absolute refusal to accept defeat as long as any alternative remained possible. But there was more to it than simple stubbornness. As I prepare my next report to the Confederate High Council, I found myself struggling to explain what I had learned about human psychology and motivation. They weren't just fighting for survival. They were fighting for principles that seemed to matter more to them than their own lives. And perhaps most disturbing of all, they were winning. The journey back to Confederate space would take several days, giving me time to observe how the crew of the Defiance processed their experiences and prepared for whatever challenges lay ahead. But already I knew that my original assessment of human military capabilities had been fundamentally flawed. These weren't primitive warriors who had stumbled into temporary success through luck and desperation. They were something much more dangerous, a species that had weaponized hope itself. During the return journey to Confederate space, I was granted access to human historical archives that fundamentally changed my understanding of their species. What I discovered challenged every assumption the Galactic Confederation had made about these remarkable beings. Lieutenant Sarah Park, the ship's communications officer, had been assigned to assist me with my research. She seemed genuinely puzzled by my request to review human military history. Observer, most of our significant conflicts happened before we achieved interstellar flight. Are you sure that's relevant to your study of contemporary human combat behavior? Lieutenant, I am beginning to suspect that understanding your species requires understanding your origins. Your tactics and attitudes appear to have historical precedents that might explain your current military effectiveness. What I found in those archives was both fascinating and deeply disturbing. Humans have been engaged in warfare for their entire recorded history, but their approach to conflict had evolved in ways that no other known species had experienced. The pattern became clear as I studied battle after battle, war after war. Humans didn't just fight for territory or resources, though those motivations certainly existed. They fought for concepts that other species would consider abstract: freedom, justice, dignity, the right to self-determination. More remarkably, they had repeatedly demonstrated willingness to accept enormous sacrifices in defense of these principles. Lieutenant Park, I said during one of our research sessions, this battle described as Thermopylae. 300 warriors chose to face certain death against overwhelming odds. Why? She paused in her work to consider the question. They were buying time, Observer. Their sacrifice allowed their city-state to prepare for the larger invasion. They knew they were going to die, but they also knew their deaths would mean something. But the tactical situation was hopeless. Logic would suggest retreat and regrouping for a more favorable engagement. Logic isn't everything, Observer. Those 300 men chose to make a statement that free people would rather die fighting than live as slaves. The psychological impact of their sacrifice was worth more than the tactical value of preserving their lives. This concept of meaningful sacrifice appeared repeatedly throughout human history. Warriors who chose death over surrender, not because retreat was impossible, but because surrender would compromise principles they valued more than their own lives. Soldiers who threw themselves on explosive devices to save their comrades. Ordinary citizens who took up arms against superior forces rather than submit to occupation. But perhaps most remarkable were the examples of humans who had achieved victory against impossible odds through sheer determination and creative thinking. I spent hours studying an engagement called the Battle of Midway, where human naval forces had defeated a numerically superior enemy through intelligence gathering, tactical innovation, and precisely timed attacks that maximized their advantages while minimizing enemy strengths. The parallels to the recent engagement at Kepler were unmistakable. Your species appears to have developed warfare into an art form, I observed to Lieutenant Park during one of our sessions. Her expression grew serious. That's not something we're proud of, observer. War is a terrible thing. But humans learned early that sometimes terrible things are necessary to prevent even worse things from happening. I was beginning to understand that human military effectiveness stemmed from something unique in galactic civilization. They'd spent millennia fighting each other before they ever encountered alien threats. Every tactical innovation, every strategic principle, every military technology had been tested and refined in conflicts where defeat meant the destruction of everything they valued. Other species had achieved interstellar flight through cooperation and peaceful development. The Veltar had unified under a rational government that eliminated conflict through logical resource allocation. The hegemony had achieved dominance through technological superiority and overwhelming force applied systematically. Humans had reached the stars carrying the accumulated military wisdom of thousands of wars fought against opponents who were just as intelligent, just as determined, and just as innovative as themselves. This revelation prompted me to request access to current human military doctrine, hoping to understand how their historical experiences had shaped their modern strategic thinking. What I discovered was even more unsettling than their past conflicts. Human military planning didn't just account for the possibility of defeat. It specifically prepared for scenarios where defeat was the most likely outcome. They had developed entire tactical philosophies around concepts like acceptable losses, strategic retreat, and Pyrrhic victory. They planned not just for how to win, but for how to lose in ways that would damage their enemies and preserve the possibility of future success. Commander Elena Vasquez, the ship's strategic planning officer, agreed to explain some of these concepts during our journey back to Confederate space. Observer, you have to understand that humans have rarely had the luxury of fighting from positions of strength. Throughout most of our history, we've been the underdog. We've had to learn how to maximize our effectiveness while minimizing our weaknesses. But this approach seems to accept that defeat is inevitable. Not inevitable, observer, just possible. And if defeat is possible, you'd better have a plan for how to make it as expensive as possible for your enemy. She showed me tactical simulations that demonstrated human strategic thinking in action. Scenarios where human forces were outnumbered and outgunned, but where clever positioning, timing, and unexpected tactics could achieve limited objectives while preserving the possibility of future operations. This simulation, she explained, indicating one particularly complex scenario, assumes we're facing a hegemony invasion fleet 3 times our size. We can't win a direct engagement, so we don't try. Instead, we conduct a series of hit-and-run attacks designed to degrade their capabilities while forcing them to expend resources hunting us. But the eventual outcome remains defeat. Maybe, but by the time they defeat our forces, they've lost 30% of their fleet, they're low on supplies, and they're facing guerrilla operations on every world they try to occupy. Their victory becomes so expensive that their next offensive gets delayed or canceled entirely. This was strategic thinking on a level that no other species had achieved, because no other species had been forced to develop it. The humans had learned to weaponize their own defeat, turning every loss into a tool for achieving larger objectives. But understanding their tactical sophistication only made their current situation more puzzling. If humans were such effective warriors, why were they still confined to a relatively small portion of galactic space? Why hadn't they expanded more aggressively? The answer came during a conversation with Captain Chen herself, as we approached the boundary of Confederate space. Observer, you've been studying us for weeks now. What's your assessment of human military capabilities? I consider my response carefully. Captain, I believe your species may be the most effective warriors the galaxy has ever produced. Your tactical innovation, strategic thinking, and psychological resilience are unprecedented." Her smile was rueful. "That's kind of you to say, but you're missing something important. We're effective warriors because we've had to be, but we're not conquerors." "I do not understand the distinction. Warriors fight to protect what they value. Conquerors fight to take what others have. The hegemony conquers because conquest increases their power and resources. Humans fight because someone is threatening our homes, our families, our freedom to choose our own path." This distinction proved crucial to understanding human strategic behavior. They didn't expand aggressively because expansion wasn't their primary motivation. They fought to preserve their own independence, to protect allied species, and to prevent the spread of authoritarian regimes like the hegemony. So you fight defensive wars even when conducting offensive operations? Exactly. When we attacked that supply depot at Kepler, we weren't trying to conquer hegemony territory. We were trying to prevent them from launching their next offensive against human colonies. Every mission we undertake is ultimately about preservation, not expansion. This philosophy explained why humans have been so successful against the hegemony despite their technological and numerical disadvantages. The hegemony fought to expand their empire. Humans fought to preserve their existence. The psychological difference was enormous. A species fighting for survival would take risks that an empire seeking expansion would never accept. They would make sacrifices that conquerors wouldn't consider, because for them, the alternative to victory wasn't just defeat, it was extinction. As we entered Confederate space, I received a priority transmission from the High Council requesting my preliminary assessment of human military capabilities. The message included specific questions about human strategic intentions and their potential threat to galactic stability. I found myself in an unprecedented situation. My mission had been to observe and report on human combat behavior. But what I had learned went far beyond simple tactical analysis. I had discovered a species whose approach to warfare was fundamentally different from anything in galactic civilization. The question was how to convey this information to the Confederate High Council without triggering policies that could prove disastrous for all involved. "Captain," I said during my final briefing aboard the Defiance, "I must ask you a hypothetical question. If the Galactic Confederation were to perceive humans as a military threat requiring containment or preemptive action, how would your species respond?" Her expression grew very serious. "Observer, humans have a saying, don't mistake our desire for peace as an inability to wage war. We've been trying to find our place in galactic civilization through diplomacy and cooperation. But if the galaxy decides we're a threat that needs to be eliminated," she didn't finish the sentence, but her meaning was clear. Humans might prefer peace, but they were prepared for war. And a species that had turned warfare into an art form, that had learned to weaponize their own defeats, and that approached every conflict as a fight for survival would be a terrifying enemy for anyone foolish enough to threaten their existence. My time aboard the Defiance was ending, but my real work was just beginning. I would need to find a way to explain to the Confederate High Council that humans weren't just effective warriors. There was something unique in galactic history. They were a species that had achieved military excellence not through conquest and domination, but through centuries of defending the principles they valued most. And, perhaps most importantly, I would need to convince the Council that humanity's military capabilities should be seen as an asset to galactic civilization, not a threat to be contained. The alternative could trigger a conflict that would reshape the galaxy forever. The Confederate High Council chamber hummed with subdued conversation as the most powerful beings in the galaxy assembled to hear my report. I stood before the curved amphitheater, my datapad containing weeks of observations that would determine the future relationship between humanity and galactic civilization. Supreme Counselor Vexhai of the Altarian Federation called the session to order with a gesture of his crystalline appendages. Observer Zekthal of the Veltar Intelligence Division will present his assessment of human military capabilities and strategic intentions. I activated the holographic displays, showing images of the Defiance and her crew. Honored counselors, my findings challenge our fundamental understanding of human warfare and strategic thinking. Proceed, observer, rumbled Counselor Thakmore of the Stone Worlds Collective. We are particularly interested in your assessment of the human threat level. The phrase threat level sent a chill through my nervous system. I had spent the journey back to Confederate space preparing for this moment, knowing that my words could determine whether humanity was welcomed into galactic civilization or marked for containment. Counselors, humans are indeed formidable warriors, but not in the way our analysis predicted. I activated recordings from the battle at Kepler. Their tactical effectiveness stems not from superior technology or overwhelming numbers, but from philosophical approaches to warfare that no other known species has developed. The display showed the Defiance ramming the Hegemony flagship with her detached engineering section, the explosion illuminating both vessels in stark detail. Primitive, snorted Counselor Yithal of the Harmony Syndicate. Crude ramming attacks and suicidal tactics. These are the actions of an undeveloped species, not sophisticated warriors. With respect, Counselor Yithal, that assessment is precisely the error that makes humans so dangerous to their enemies. I advanced to the next set of recordings, showing the aftermath of the battle. What appears to be primitive desperation is actually calculated tactical innovation based on centuries of military evolution. I spent the next hour detailing human military history, their development of asymmetrical warfare, and their unique approach to strategic thinking. The council listened with growing unease as I explained how humans had weaponized concepts like sacrifice, unpredictability, and acceptable losses. Most concerning, I continued, is their psychological approach to conflict. Humans don't fight to achieve dominance. They fight to preserve their values. This makes them willing to accept casualties and risks that other species would consider irrational. Supreme Counselor Vexhai leaned forward, his bioluminescent patterns shifting to indicate intense concentration. Observer, you seem to be suggesting that human military capabilities pose a significant threat to galactic stability. Should we consider containment protocols? This was the moment I had been dreading. Counselors, I believe such an action would be catastrophic for all involved. The chamber erupted in surprised chittering and harmonics. Several counselors began speaking at once, their various forms of communication creating a cacophony of concern. Order. Vexai's crystalline form flashed with authority. Observer Zekthal, explain your assessment. I activated a new set of displays showing human colonies, trade routes, and defensive positions. Counselors, humans are currently fighting a defensive war against the Krexhai hegemony. Their military actions have been consistently focused on preservation rather than expansion. They pose no threat to galactic civilization unless they are threatened first. But their capabilities, Counselor Thakmore began, are exactly what the galaxy needs to contain the hegemony threat. I interrupted, knowing I was breaching protocol, but unable to remain silent. Counselors, the hegemony has been expanding for over a century. They have absorbed or destroyed dozens of civilizations. Only humans have been able to mount an effective resistance. I activated tactical analyses showing recent hegemony movements. Since humans began their resistance 5 years ago, hegemony expansion has slowed by 73%. Their military losses have increased exponentially, and their aggressive timeline for galactic domination has been severely disrupted. You're suggesting we should support these humans? Counselor Yithal's harmonic patterns indicated skepticism. Based on their effectiveness against our mutual enemies, I'm suggesting that humans are natural allies, not threats to be contained. Their military philosophy makes them ideal defenders of smaller civilizations against aggressive empires like the hegemony. I paused, knowing my next words would determine everything. Counselors, I witnessed something aboard that human vessel that no other species in our records has demonstrated. They were willing to sacrifice their lives not just for their own species, but for the protection of others they had never met. Their entire military doctrine is built around the concept of fighting so that others don't have to. The chamber fell silent as the council absorbed this information. Finally, Supreme Counselor Vexai spoke. Observer, are you certain of this assessment? Your recommendation could alter the balance of power in this galaxy. Counselor, I am certain. But there's more you must understand about human psychology. I activated my final set of recordings, showing the memorial service aboard the Defiance. Humans possess something that makes them uniquely dangerous to aggressive empires. They cannot be broken through intimidation or overwhelming force. The display showed Captain Chen addressing her crew after the battle, her words carrying the weight of absolute conviction. We fight not because we seek war, but because peace must be defended. Every enemy ship we destroy, every advance we delay, is a victory for every peaceful species in the galaxy. This philosophy, I explained, means that attempting to contain or eliminate humans would trigger exactly the kind of resistance that makes them so effective against the hegemony. They would view such action as an existential threat requiring total commitment to defense. Counselor Thakmore's massive form shifted with what I recognized as concern. Observer, are you suggesting that the Confederation could not successfully contain the human threat if it became necessary? Counselor, I am suggesting that attempting to do so would transform humans from natural allies into the most dangerous enemies the galaxy has ever faced. They have proven capable of defeating technologically superior forces through innovation, determination, and tactical thinking that other species cannot replicate. I activated one final display, showing strategic projections based on human military effectiveness. If the Confederation were to attack human space, we would likely achieve initial success through technological superiority. But humans would adapt, innovate, and turn our own advantages against us. The conflict would be devastating for both sides. More importantly, I continued, such a war would serve the hegemony's interests by eliminating their most effective opposition and forcing the Confederation to commit resources to suppressing humans rather than containing hegemony expansion. The implications of this analysis settled over the chamber like a heavy cloud. Several counselors began private communications, their various species' methods of consultation creating a subdued symphony of concern and calculation. Supreme Counselor Vexai, finally, spoke again. Observer Zekthal, what specific recommendations do you make regarding human-Confederate relations? Counselors, I recommend immediate diplomatic outreach to establish formal alliance protocols. Humans should be offered full membership in the Confederate Defense Network, with their military expertise incorporated into our strategic planning. Furthermore, I recommend joint operations against hegemony forces, allowing human tactical innovation to be combined with Confederate technological capabilities. The result would be a military force capable of not just containing, but actually rolling back hegemony expansion. The debate that followed lasted for hours. Some counselors expressed concern about allying with a species whose military capabilities were still not fully understood. Others worried about setting precedents that might encourage aggressive behavior among other developing species. But the strategic reality was undeniable. The hegemony represented an existential threat to galactic civilization, and humans had proven uniquely effective at combating that threat. Finally, Supreme Counselor Vexai called for a formal vote. The question before the Council: should the Galactic Confederation pursue formal alliance with the human species, integrating their military capabilities into our collective defense strategy? The vote was closer than I had hoped, but decisive enough to move forward. 17 systems in favor, 11 opposed, 3 abstentions. Humanity would be offered full membership in the galactic community with all the rights and responsibilities that entailed. As the council session ended, Counselor Vexai approached me privately. Observer, your assessment was persuasive. But I must ask, are you certain that humans can be trusted as allies rather than managed as a potential threat? I thought of Captain Shun and her crew, Their willingness to risk everything for principles they held sacred, their determination to protect others at the cost of their own lives. Counselor, I have observed humans under extreme stress, facing impossible odds, making decisions that will determine the survival of their species. In every case, they chose to fight not for conquest or domination, but for the protection of others. If such beings cannot be trusted as allies, then alliance itself has no meaning in this galaxy. Months later, I received a transmission from Captain Chun. The Defiance had been assigned to a joint Confederate human task force conducting operations against hegemony supply lines. The mission had been a complete success, with human tactical innovation and Confederate technology proving to be a devastatingly effective combination. Observer, her message concluded, I wanted to thank you for whatever you told the Council. Humans have been fighting alone for so long that we'd almost forgotten what it felt like to have allies. Your report gave us something we thought we'd lost. Hope for a galaxy where different species can stand together against those who would destroy everything we've built. As I filed my final report on the Human Integration Project, I reflected on what I had learned during my time aboard the Defiance. Humans were indeed the most effective warriors the galaxy had ever produced, but not because they were the most aggressive or technologically advanced. They were effective because they had learned to fight for something greater than themselves. They had weaponized hope, turned sacrifice into strategy, and transformed their greatest weakness, their refusal to accept defeat, into their greatest strength. The galaxy was a safer place with humans as allies. And, perhaps more importantly, it was a better place because humans had shown that military power could be used not to dominate others, but to protect the freedom of all. In the end, my mission to observe humans in battle had taught me something profound about the nature of strength itself. True power didn't come from the ability to destroy one's enemies, but from the willingness to stand between those enemies and everything worth protecting. And in that regard, humans were the strongest species the galaxy had ever known.